She found a dying boy in an alley. She made one phone call. Everything changed. Amara Okafor wasn't supposed to be on Franklin Avenue that night. The county hospital had been chaos. A 17-car pileup on the interstate had consumed every bed, every doctor, every ounce of her focus for 8 hours straight. She'd volunteered for the overtime, desperate to chip away at her mother's medical bills back in Lagos, where her younger siblings depended on her remote financial support. At 23, Amara carried the weight of a family on shoulders, still learning what it meant to survive alone in Chicago. The hospital had been a battlefield, paramedics wheeling in stretchers faster than the triage nurses could process them. A woman with a compound fracture screaming for her children. A man with a crushed chest. His breathing labored, his eyes searching for hope that Amara couldn't provide. She'd worked 12 hours with no break, no bathroom reprieve, no moment to acknowledge that she was witnessing the edge of human fragility. The senior attending had pulled her aside during a brief lull around hour 9. Dr. Rodriguez was a woman who'd worked in emergency medicine for 23 years, who had seen everything the city could throw at human bodies, and she looked at Amara with something that might have been concern or might have been warning. "You can't save everyone," Dr. Rodriguez had said, watching Amara's hands shake as she tried to start in 4 on a trauma patient. "The ones you lose will haunt you, but the ones you save, they're why you keep showing up." Amara had nodded, swallowing the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her, and returned to the chaos. The money didn't make up for it. Almost did, but not quite. She cut through the alley, not because it was smart, but because she'd done it 100 times before, and poverty doesn't grant the luxury of fear. The January cold bit through her scrubs. She'd forgotten her coat in her locker during the chaos of triage. Hadn't even thought to retrieve it before rushing out of the building. Her hands were raw from the hospital's industrial soap. Her feet ached from standing on concrete. Her mind was already calculating the deposit she'd make tomorrow. Another $2,000 toward her mother's treatment. The alley smelled like garbage and desperation. Like every alley in this neighborhood, a mixture of rotting food, human waste, and the particular odor of poverty that Chicago's wealthy neighborhoods never acknowledged. Street lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that moved like living things. Amara had learned to walk quickly through these spaces to keep her head down, to make herself invisible. That's when she saw him. Not a pile of clothes, not discarded garbage. A boy's expensive winter coat draped like a funeral shroud across his shoulders. His dark skin turned ashen beneath the flickering security light. His breathing was shallow, wrong, the kind of wrong that made her nurse's instinct scream. The visceral recognition that death was present in this alley, that this body was in the process of shutting down. She didn't think. Her body moved on instinct, muscle memory overriding rational thought. She approached carefully. Never know who or what you might encounter in alleys. But when she saw his face, she saw only vulnerability. A teenager, probably 14, maybe 15. Expensive sneakers, designer watch. The kind of kid who grew up without understanding that the world could hurt him. Until now, she knelt beside him, her scrubs absorbing the dirty snow of the Chicago alley. She checked his pulse, weak, rapid, concerning. She started her mental catalog of symptoms, the clinical assessment her nursing professors had drilled into her during hundreds of simulated scenarios. Cold skin, rapid shallow breathing, a medical alert bracelet on his left wrist. She moved closer, reading it through the darkness. Type 1 diabetic, critical glucose sensitivity. The continuous glucose monitor on his left wrist showed a number that made her blood turn to ice. 35 milligrams per deciliter. Normal range was 70 to 100. Below 54 was dangerous. Below 40 was life-threatening. He was below 40. "Hey," she whispered, her Nigerian accent cutting through the urban silence, softer than usual. The way she learned to speak to terrified people in the air. "Can you hear me? Don't move. I'm a nurse. You're going to be okay." His pupils were dilating. Hypoglycemic shock. The brain was already suffering from glucose deprivation. If she didn't intervene in the next 5 minutes, he'd seize. Then brain damage, then death. The cascade was inevitable once it started. Amara's hands moved on muscle memory born from countless rotations through the hospital's endocrinology wing. She opened his designer backpack, her fingers searching with practice efficiency. She found the emergency kit, pristine, professionally organized, probably cost more than her monthly rent, and located the glucose tab dispenser. She placed 2 tabs under his tongue, supporting his head, keeping his airway clear. Then she waited 30 seconds, 60 seconds. His face was still gray. She was starting to consider her options. Would anyone in this neighborhood have a phone? Would 911 actually help in a place like Franklin Avenue? Would they even care about a kid like this? When his breathing began to change, deeper, more regular, the immediate crisis beginning to resolve, that's when she noticed the phone premium, obscenely expensive, the kind of phone that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. The lock screen showed only one emergency contact displayed in bold white letters. Father, not a name, not dad, not even papa. Just that single word, like a title worn by someone too important for names. Someone so powerful that they didn't need to be called anything else. Amara hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she weighed the options. Call an ambulance and watch this kid die while waiting for help in a neighborhood where ambulances took 20 minutes minimum. Call his father and enter a world she didn't understand. Call the police and risk complications she couldn't predict. She thought of her own father, dead 3 years now from malaria, that could have been treated if they'd had money for proper medical care. She thought of how she'd held his hand in a Legos hospital while he died because they couldn't afford the medication that would have saved him. She thought of promises she'd made to herself about never letting someone die when she had the power to intervene. Then she pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice. In the silence of the connection, she heard her own heartbeat, heard the distant wail of a siren blocks away, heard her own survival instincts screaming that she was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. A man answered before the second ring. Gene Blackwood. Even his voice was expensive, a blend of Korean precision and American power. Each syllable cut like a diamond. Daniel. This isn't Daniel, Amara said, her voice steadier than her hands. My name is Amara Okafor. I'm a nurse in training, and I found your son collapsed in an alley on Franklin Avenue. His continuous glucose monitor shows critical hypoglycemia. He's been unconscious for approximately 5 minutes. His breathing is compromised. She was speaking the language of medicine, using clinical distance as a shield against the fear coursing through her nervous system. Detach from emotion, present the facts, let the data do the emotional work. The silence stretched like a held breath. She could hear him breathing on the other end, could almost feel him calculating through the phone line. She imagined him somewhere in Chicago's wealthy neighborhoods, in a penthouse or mansion, suddenly confronted with the reality that his son was dying in an alley in one of the city's most dangerous areas. When Gene spoke again, his voice had transformed into something that made her understand with crystalline clarity that this man wasn't used to hearing no. He was used to hearing yes. He was used to people obeying. He was used to power. How old are you? You should be running. He'll die if I do. Amara replied simply. His blood sugar is too low. He needs more glucose, and he needs someone to stay with him until stay exactly where you are. Don't run. Don't call anyone else. I'm 8 minutes away. The line went dead. Amara's rational mind was already running calculations. This was how women disappeared in alleys. This was how good intentions led to trafficking statistics. This was how people like her, alone, foreign, and poor, became invisible until someone found their body in an abandoned warehouse months later. But the boy's breathing was getting worse. His lips were turning gray. His glucose would continue to drop without intervention. She administered another glucose tab, monitoring his vital signs with the portion of her brain that still functioned on clinical training. The rest of her mind was spinning through scenarios, each one worse than the last. She thought about texting her roommate, creating a record of where she was, but her phone had died hours ago during the chaos at the hospital. She stayed. The alley felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. A cat emerged from behind a dumpster, regarded her with yellow eyes, and disappeared. Somewhere in the distance, she heard music. Someone's radio playing salsa. The rhythm incongruous with the life or death drama playing out in the frozen darkness. Daniel's eyelids fluttered. His glucose monitor showed 48 milligrams per deciliter. Still dangerous, but climbing. She kept her hand on his pulse, feeling the rhythm strengthen, feeling life reassert itself against the void that had been pulling him under. Gene Blackwood didn't arrive like a concerned father. He arrived like an invasion. The black SUV pulled to the curb at exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds. Amara knew because she'd been counting, her anxiety measuring time in seconds, her fear creating precise metrics. 3 men emerged in synchronized precision, 2 positioning themselves with the casual posture of people trained in violence, while the third moved towards Amara with the certainty of someone who had never been told no. He was tall, the kind of tall that made ordinary men recalibrate their understanding of presence. His coat was charcoal wool, the kind that cost more than Amara's monthly rent. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were identical to the boy's, the exact same dark, penetrating gaze, except his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen things that killed the softness in a person. Amara noticed other things in that first moment of assessment. The way he moved like a predator, conserving energy, the way his bodyguards positioned themselves, creating a perimeter without being told. The way he assessed the alley in a single sweeping glance, cataloging exits and threats with the efficiency of someone trained in tactical operations. Amara Okafor, he said, not asking, confirming. His accent was barely present, worn smooth by years in America, but the clipped efficiency of Korean remained in his consonants. The precise enunciation of someone who viewed language as a tool to be wielded. I'm Gene Blackwood. Thank you for staying. There was no warmth in the thank you. It was strategic, tactical, the way someone thanks a business associate for completing a transaction. He knelt beside Daniel with the efficiency of someone who had done this before multiple times. His hands were scarred, not from accidents, but from intentional violence. The kind of scars you got from fighting people, from control, from power expressed through physical domination. Daniel's diabetes is type 1 onset, incredibly unstable, Gene explained, not to her, but as a way of establishing his competence, his control. He was performing competence for an audience of one Amara, establishing that he understood this world, that he had dealt with this crisis before, that he was in control. He's had it since he was 8 years old. Most type 1s are manageable with standard protocols. His aren't. He produced a glucose injection pen from his inner coat pocket. The movements practiced, ritualized, found the vein in Daniel's neck with surgical precision. His fingers were gentle but authoritative, the way a surgeon's would be. He administered the injection like a man who had practiced this procedure 1,000 times. Within 90 seconds, Daniel's eyelids fluttered. Within 2 minutes, his pupils constricted. Color returned to his face. The gray pallor replaced by something resembling health. Daniel's voice was confused, slurred. The sound of someone emerging from unconsciousness into a world that didn't yet make sense. You forgot your emergency kit again, Gene said, his tone carrying the weight of parental frustration mixed with something deeper, something that looked like fear. The authentic raw fear of a parent who had almost lost a child. That's the 3rd time this month. I thought I could make it home. You thought wrong. You almost died. You would be dead in 10 minutes if this woman hadn't found you. Amara watched the interaction with the trained eye of someone who had spent years observing family dynamics in hospital rooms. There was love here, complicated and damaged, but genuine. Jin's hand trembled slightly as he helped Daniel sit up. A microscopic betrayal of the terror he'd felt during the drive to this alley. The tenderness in the way he helped his son to his feet contradicted everything else about him. For a moment, Amara saw something human beneath the tailored suit and scarred knuckles. A father, terrified, grateful. Then Gene turned to her, and that humanity vanished like smoke. Why didn't you call an ambulance? There are no ambulances in this neighborhood at night, Amara replied. They take 20 minutes minimum. Your son wouldn't have survived it. Gene studied her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen being cataloged in a laboratory. He was calculating something, weighing her, assessing her value like a businessman appraising an asset. You're not American, he observed. Nigerian, Legos originally, and you didn't run. No, that's unusual. In medicine, we don't run from people who need help, Amara said, her jaw tightening. Even when it's terrifying. Something flickered across his face, a recognition perhaps, or an evaluation. She passed some tests she hadn't known she was taking. He reached into his coat pocket, and Amara's entire nervous system went into overdrive. People who moved, like Gene Blackwood, didn't typically carry guns in their coat pockets, but they carried other things that could change a life, things that could erase a life. For 3 seconds, she genuinely believed he might be reaching for a weapon. He withdrew a business card. It was thick, Expensive, cream-colored with lettering and silver. Nothing but a phone number, no name, no title, no corporation or business designation. Just 10 digits that somehow felt more powerful than any name could have been. "Call this number tomorrow morning at 9, he said. "I have a proposition for you." "I don't need." Amara started. "You do," he interrupted, not unkindly. "Everyone needs something. I suspect you need it more than most." He placed the card in her hand. Her palm was shaking, though she tried to hide it, and walked back to the SUV. Daniel, still groggy but conscious, looked back at her with an expression that suggested he understood something Amara didn't. A warning maybe, or a prayer. The SUV pulled away into the Chicago night, leaving Amara alone on the frozen sidewalk, the business card burning in her palm like it had weight, like it had consequence. She stood there for 10 minutes, unable to move, her heart still racing, her mind trying to process what had just happened. The card felt warm despite the freezing temperature. Felt alive. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You're being watched. It's for your protection. Go home. Don't speak about what happened. Call the number at 9. And Miss Okafor, thank you for my son's life." Amara walked home through streets that suddenly felt different. She noticed the car that pulled away from the curb 2 blocks behind her. Noticed the man in the coffee shop window who seemed to be watching her reflection. The city had changed, or she had changed, or both. In her tiny apartment, her roommate was already asleep. Amara sat on her bed holding the business card, understanding that she was standing at a crossroads. Tomorrow morning at 9, she could call that number and step into a world she didn't understand. Or she could ignore it, pretend this night never happened, continue her small, struggling life. She thought of her mother's medical bills, thought of her brother's diagnosis, thought of Dr. Rodriguez's words. "The ones you save, they're why you keep showing up." She set an alarm for 8:45 a.m. The Blackwood residence wasn't a house. It was a statement of power made manifest in stone and glass. Architecture as intimidation, wealth as weapon. The gates opened as Amara's ancient Honda pulled into the circular drive as if they'd been expecting her, because she realized with a chill they had been watching. All night, all morning. Security cameras positioned throughout the city had tracked her movements from the alley to the hospital parking garage to her apartment to this moment. A security guard checked her ID at the gate. The only moment of doubt appeared in his expression when he saw her information. Temporary resident visa, employment authorization pending. Graduate of a community nursing program. His jaw tightened slightly, as if assessing whether she was worth admitting. She was admitted. The driveway curved through manicured grounds that looked like they required a full-time staff to maintain. Amara's Honda looked like a refugee from a junkyard parked beside the fountain. An ornate marble structure featuring what appeared to be a Korean dragon, water cascading from its mouth in an endless loop. The mansion's interior was all marble and mahogany, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The entryway alone was larger than her entire apartment. A woman introduced as Mrs. Wu, the housekeeper, met her in the foyer with tea that smelled like jasmine and power. She was probably in her 60s, with a kind face of someone who had learned to survive in this household by becoming invisible. "Blackwood is ready for you," Mrs. Wu said gently, her accent suggesting she was originally from Taiwan or mainland China. "He's in his study. Second door on the left." As Mrs. Wu guided her through the hallway, Amara noticed details. Family photographs and expensive frames showing Daniel at various ages. A woman who appeared in the early photos but disappeared after Daniel turned 12. The same woman whose absence felt like a wound in the house's architecture. "That's Mrs. Blackwood," Mrs. Wu said softly, noticing Amara's gaze. "She passed 3 years ago. Blackwood hasn't removed the photographs. I think he needs the reminder." Amara's hands were shaking as she walked down the hallway. She'd made a decision at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling of her shared apartment in a building that regularly lost heat in winter that she would refuse the offer. Whatever it was, whatever Jean Blackwood wanted, it would come with a price she couldn't afford to pay. But her mother's hospital bills were $47,000 and climbing. And her youngest brother, Dee, just been diagnosed with sickle cell anemia, and winter in Chicago was coming, and her apartment's landlord had already warned about the rent increase. And she was tired, so impossibly tired of struggling. So she walked into the study. Jean was on a video call speaking rapid Korean into a headset. He didn't disconnect. Instead, He held up one finger weight and continued his conversation, speaking in a language Amara didn't understand, though the tone suggested he was explaining a decision that others disagreed with. She heard shipment and Donovan and what might have been resolved, but mostly the words were incomprehensible. The meaning, however, was clear. This was a man accustomed to making life-altering decisions, to having his orders questioned by people beneath him, to wielding power without apology. The study itself was a revelation. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes in multiple languages. A desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of dark wood. Windows overlooking gardens that suggested an army of landscapers, and on one wall, a painting Korean traditional depicting what looked like a family ancestral ceremony. When he finally hung up, he turned to her with the full weight of his attention. "I'm going to ask you several questions, and I want honest answers," he began. "Not polite answers, not answers you think I want to hear. True answers." Amara nodded. "Do you have family depending on your income? Do you have debts? Significant debt?" She almost lied. The programming ran deep. Never show weakness to authority. Never admit vulnerability. Never let them know how desperate you are. "Yes," she said finally. "Very significant. Are you considering leaving Chicago?" This one made her pause. "Not if I can help it. This is where the opportunity is. This is where I can earn enough to matter." Gene leaned back in his chair. He was wearing a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the tattoo on his left forearm. Korean characters in black ink that she didn't recognize but understood carried meaning. She would later learn it meant family above all. But in this moment, she only knew it represented something she didn't fully understand. "Daniel's diabetes is unusually complicated," he explained. "He's had it since he was 8 years old, but 3 years ago, his condition destabilized significantly. His glucose levels fluctuate unpredictably. Standard management isn't effective. He requires constant monitoring, anticipatory intervention," and he paused, looking for the word compassion, not clinical distance, actual care. "What happened 3 years ago?" Amara asked, then immediately regretted the question. It wasn't her place. She was a potential employee, not a confidant. But Gene answered anyway. "His mother was murdered." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Amara felt them ripple through her understanding of everything she'd observed. The protective intensity, the scarred knuckles, the security presence, the way he'd moved with the precision of someone who knew violence intimately. "A business associate tried to strike at me through her," Gene continued, his voice carefully controlled, each word measured. "He thought if he removed what I cared about most, he could control me. Instead, he created a man with nothing left to lose. He created a man willing to destroy everything. But Daniel became something else. He became a reminder of what I'd failed to protect. And his condition worsened as if his body understood that I'd failed him and decided to punish me further." Amara said nothing. This wasn't information meant for responses. This was confession, the kind people made when they needed to justify themselves to someone whose opinion might matter. His previous medical companion, a woman he trusted, recently accepted a position elsewhere. Daniel refuses to accept a replacement. He's volatile, difficult, and he's currently in significant danger. Not just from his condition, but from— he paused again, calculating how much to reveal. "Other factors in my life." "What kind of factors?" Amara asked. "The kind you don't need to know about unless you accept my offer," Gene replied. "But you need to understand something, Miss Okafor. If you take this position, you will be embedded in a world that doesn't follow the rules you're accustomed to. A world where danger is not theoretical, where consequences are real, where the decision you make in the next 5 minutes could fundamentally alter the trajectory of your life." Amara's mouth was dry. "What's the offer?" "Live here. Be Daniel's medical monitor. Manage his condition. Accompany him to school, medical appointments, and certain social functions. $180,000 per year, plus housing, food, and education support. You can continue your nursing degree through an accelerated program I've arranged. Upon completion of the contract, 2 years minimum, you'll have $360,000 in savings plus full sponsorship for permanent residency status in the United States." The number was obscene. It was generational wealth for someone like her. It was the answer to every prayer she'd whispered to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. It was also a trap, and she knew it. But it was a trap with a door she could actually open. "Why me? You could hire anyone. Someone with more experience. Someone less complicated because you didn't run, Jean said simply. Because you made a medical assessment in an alley at night alone with a stranger and you did your job. Because the most valuable trait in my world isn't credentials. It's moral character. It's knowing someone won't sell out when pressure arrives. It's recognizing that some people are incapable of abandoning someone in need. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. I need to know Daniel is safe, not with someone hired for a paycheck. With someone who would stay in an alley in the freezing cold and help a stranger because it's the right thing to do. Amara thought of her mother in Lagos lying in a hospital bed waiting for a surgery that costs more than Amara's annual income. Of her brother learning to live with a chronic disease. Of the apartment where she'd never felt warm enough. Where the landlord threatened eviction every month. Where hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. She thought of her father's death, of holding his hand while he died from something that could have been prevented with money she didn't have. She thought of the promises she'd made to herself about never being helpless again. I'll need to give notice at the hospital, she heard herself say. It's already been done, Jean replied. I have a very efficient administration. Your position here starts tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Wu will show you to your quarters. He turned back to his computer, already disconnecting from her psychologically, already moving on to the next calculation, the next crisis, the next opportunity to exert control. Amara stood, her entire body vibrating with the magnitude of what she just agreed to. She'd stepped through a door. There was no closing it. Miss Okafor, Jean said, not looking up from his screen. Don't unpack everything. The ability to leave quickly is a valuable skill in my household. Daniel wasn't waiting in the study when Amara began work the next morning. He was in his bedroom, refusing to come down, his teenage defiance projecting through the mansion like a sonic weapon. The first morning, there was silence. The second morning, there was a text to his father. I don't need a babysitter. I especially don't need a babysitter. I've never met. Jin's response had been swift and devastating. Your glucose control has deteriorated. You nearly died in an alley. She's not negotiable. Accept it or lose your freedom. Your choice. But one comes faster than the other. Daniel had not come down for breakfast. Amara spent those first 2 days learning the mansion's rhythms. Wu taught her the household schedules, the places where Jean conducted business that she should avoid, the security protocols that govern movement throughout the property. She learned that the third floor was off limits except for specific personnel, that certain rooms were monitored by cameras at all times, that Jin's business associates arrived through a separate entrance and never crossed paths with Daniel. She also learned that Daniel's room was a fortress of teenage isolation. Gaming equipment, art supplies scattered across every surface, medical supplies organized with the precision of someone who had learned to manage their own survival. Amara found him on the second floor landing on the third morning, sitting cross-legged on the marble tiles. His continuous glucose monitor reading 187, elevated, likely stress-induced. He had his father's eyes, but not his restraint. Every emotion moved across his face like weather. Anger, fear, resignation, all cycling through in rapid succession. I'm not the enemy, Amara said quietly, sitting down beside him without being invited. A risk maybe, but she'd learned that teenage boys respond better to someone who doesn't treat them like problems to be managed. I'm a nurse who's been hired to help manage your medical care. That's all. You're a spy, Daniel replied, not looking at her. Dad's trying to prove he can control everything. It's not enough that he controls Chicago's entire underworld. He has to control me, too. Amara processed this information carefully. Underworld, organized crime, the words she'd been avoiding, the implications she'd been suppressing. Okay, she said slowly. And how's that control working out for your health? Daniel looked at her, and she saw the crack in his armor, the moment of genuine vulnerability beneath the defensive anger. I'm tired, he said. I'm tired of being the thing he's terrified of losing. I'm tired of being the leverage in whatever wars he's fighting. And I'm tired of dying slowly while he pretends everything is fine. Your father isn't pretending, Amara said, and she meant it. I saw his face when I told him you were dying. That's not a man pretending. Something shifted in Daniel. A recognition perhaps, or a grudging acceptance that she wasn't here to be his jailer. They sat in silence for several minutes. Amara noticed things about him she hadn't observed in the alley. The way his hands moved, constantly, fidgeting with the glucose monitor, adjusting his shirt cuffs, the nervous energy of someone who had learned that stillness meant vulnerability. "There's a girl," he said after a long silence at the community college library. "She comes in on Thursdays around 6 p.m. Her name is Sophia. She studies engineering. She's brilliant and funny and completely unaware that I exist, which is exactly how it needs to be." Amara understood what he was saying, what he was offering. "My father's people have been watching that library since I was 7 years old," Daniel continued. "They photographed everyone who studies there. They've recorded every conversation. There's nothing on her. No connections, no vulnerabilities. She's clean, so she's safe. But only as long as I don't exist for her. The moment I matter to her, she becomes leverage." The tragedy of his life settled over them like snow. "What does she study?" Amara asked. "Mechanical engineering. She's designing prosthetics for children in developing countries. Something about accessible healthcare and reducing production costs." Daniel's face transformed when he talked about her. The anger and fear replaced by something that looked like hope. "She presents her work every other Thursday. I've been to 12 of her presentations. She has no idea. Have you ever spoken to her?" "Once she asked if I could help her reach a book on the top shelf. I said yes. She said thank you. That was the entire conversation, and it's probably the best 2 minutes of my life." Amara felt her heart break for this boy who couldn't even experience a normal teenage crush without fearing for someone's safety. "I'll help," Amara said, "however I can." Daniel looked at her, and for the first time his expression wasn't guarded. "Thank you for not running," he said. Over the next weeks, Amara learned the architecture of Daniel's condition. His glucose didn't just fluctuate. It plummeted without warning, spiked from stress, responded to emotional states in ways that defied standard diabetic management. She learned that Thursdays were the hardest days when he went to the library to watch Sophia present her work and his glucose would drop from the stress of proximity. She learned that he tested his blood sugar 17 times a day, more than any diabetic she'd encountered. She learned that he slept with alarms set every 2 hours to check his levels. She also learned that he was brilliant, that his room was filled with sketches of architectural designs, mathematical equations, philosophical treatises written in margins of textbooks, that he spoke 3 languages fluently and was teaching himself a 4th, that his isolation had created space for a mind that consumed knowledge like oxygen. "Why architecture?" she asked one afternoon, finding him sketching what looked like a building design. "Because buildings last," Daniel replied. "People die, power shifts, empires fall, but buildings remain. They outlive the people who created them. They become monuments to the fact that someone existed and made something that mattered." Amara thought about that answer for a long time. 6 weeks in, Amara understood the architecture of Jin's world. It was a kingdom of power maintained through violence, money, and information. Security personnel moved through specific routes at specific times, like a choreographed dance performed by men trained to kill. Business meetings happened in locked rooms on the 3rd floor. Phone calls were conducted in multiple languages: Korean, Mandarin, Russian, English. The scarred men who served as bodyguards carried weapons with the unconscious confidence of people trained to use them as extensions of their bodies. And Jean moved through it all with the authority of someone born to power, someone who had inherited violence the way other people inherit money. Amara also understood that she was being tested. The first test came when she overheard a conversation about a shipment complication at the harbor and a negotiation with the O'Brien family, not the housekeeper, a different family entirely going poorly. She said nothing. She didn't ask questions. She pretended she hadn't heard. The second test came when Jin's security chief showed her surveillance photos of 3 men photographing her former apartment building. "For your safety, Marcus," the security chief had explained, "we're ensuring nothing interferes with your ability to do your job." She said nothing. She didn't panic. The third test came at a spring charity gala where Chicago's elite gathered to celebrate their wealth while pretending to care about charity. It was theater, the performance of morality by people who had forgotten what morality meant. Jean had decided that Daniel needed to be presented to Chicago society as healthy and stable, which meant Amara needed to be visible. A dress arrived in her quarters, emerald silk that probably cost more than her first month's salary. A note in Jin's precise handwriting for the gala. "You're necessary." The O'Brien family estate was a fortress disguised as a palace. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across walls that had witnessed centuries of Chicago's underworld politics. Waiters circulated with champagne that cost more per bottle than Amara's weekly salary. Chicago's elite circulated like sharks, scenting blood in the water, hunting for advantage, for weakness, for anyone who might be leveraged in their endless game of power. Amara stayed close to Daniel, monitoring his glucose, watching for the signs of stress that made his blood sugar volatile. Gene moved through the room with predatory grace, his handshakes lasting exactly long enough to be cordial, his eye contact never wavering. She realized, watching him work the room, that this was his arena. This was where he hunted. Patrick O'Brien appeared during dinner, a man with the kind of smile that made her instinctively reach for Daniel's hand. He greeted Gene with the false warmth of a longtime enemy, his movements calculated, his charm weaponized. "And who?" Patrick asked, his gaze finding Amara. "Is this fascinating addition to your household?" "Amara Watson," Gene replied, the lie delivered so smoothly that Amara nearly believed it herself. She was being renamed. She realized neutralized made less foreign, less other, less interesting. Jin's hand rested at the small of her back. And in that moment, Amara understood. She was being presented as his intimate. Not his lover, but someone close enough to matter, someone worth knowing about. It was a message written on her body, a claim staked in public. The orchestra began playing after dinner. Daniel's hands were trembling. A glucose check confirmed what she already knew. 71 milligrams per deciliter and dropping. The sophisticated environment, the alpha predator circulating, the tension between his father and Patrick O'Brien. It was burning through his glucose like an accelerant. "We need air," she murmured to Gene, keeping her voice light. Professional, they made it to the terrace just as Daniel's legs buckled. Amara worked methodically, her hands steady despite the audience from inside the ballroom. The other guests had noticed the young man's collapse, and they were watching with a hungry intensity of people witnessing scandal in the making. That's when Patrick O'Brien appeared in the terrace doorway, his expression predatory. "Well," he said softly, "isn't that interesting? Young Daniel Blackwood suffering from what appears to be a serious medical condition. I wonder how many people would find that detail valuable." Jin's body went very still. The transformation was barely visible. A shift in his breathing, a tightening of his jaw, but Amara recognized it from her rotations. It was the body language of someone calculating how many people they'd need to kill. "Get Daniel to the car," Gene ordered, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. Now the car ride home was silent except for Jin's phone calls, each one delivered in clipped Korean. Amara didn't understand the language, but she understood the meaning. Contingencies were being activated. Plans were being modified. Someone was going to pay. In the foyer, Gene turned to her with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was calculation. "O'Brien's men have already begun investigating your background," he said without preamble. "Questioning your neighbors, photographing your former associates, accessing your medical school records, the apartment building, her study group, her faculty advisor." Amara asked though she already knew. "Because you're connected to me, and in my world, connection is weakness." Gene moved to his study window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "O'Brien believes that understanding you will give him leverage. That if he can find something in your past, something you're running from, someone you care about, he can use it to compromise me. My mother," Amara said quietly, "my siblings in Lagos. They're vulnerable. They will be protected," Gene replied. "I have associates in Lagos. Your mother will have medical care. Your brother's treatment will be funded. But understand this, Miss Okafor. You are now embedded in a war. There's no stepping out. There's no going back." Amara felt the walls of the mansion close in around her. She'd made a choice in an alley on a frozen night, and now that choice was consuming her entire existence. "I didn't agree to this," she said, anger cutting through her fear. "I agreed to be a nurse." "You agreed to be part of my household," Gene corrected, turning to face her. "And in my household, everyone's loyalty is eventually tested." The weight of what she'd accepted settled over her like a burial shroud. Dawn was breaking when Jin's security chief burst into the study without knocking. A breach of protocol that instantly put Amara on alert. "Sir, we have confirmation. O'Brien's holding Elena at the industrial warehouse. He's using her as bait." Amara watched Jin's face transform. The name Elena carried weight. She didn't understand, but could feel in the sudden tension that filled the room. "Who's Elena?" she asked. Jin's eyes met hers, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something that looked like raw grief mixed with desperate, dangerous hope. "My wife," he said quietly. "Daniel's mother. The woman I thought died 3 years ago." The warehouse rescue played out like a nightmare filmed in slow motion. Armed men emerging from shadows. Gunfire echoing through concrete corridors. Amara pressed against walls, her medical training useless against the chaos of violence. She followed Jean and Marcus through the maze of shipping containers, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear the gunfire. When they found Elena on the 3rd floor, Amara's clinical mind took over. She was in a metal chair, restrained, but not physically damaged. At least not in ways she could immediately see. The psychological damage, however, was written across her face. Her eyes had the hollow quality of someone who had been stripped of everything. Amara's training kicked in. She released the restraints, assessed her vitals, prepared her for movement. Elena didn't speak. She simply looked at Jean with an expression that contained every emotion that existed. Relief, gratitude, trauma, terror. "We need to move," Marcus said. And they were running, Amara supporting Elena, Jean covering their exit with precision and lethal efficiency. When they emerged from the warehouse, Jean was wounded. A gunshot to the shoulder, a deep cut across his ribs, but Elena was alive. The woman he thought he'd lost forever was breathing because Amara had stayed when anyone else would have run. 6 hours later, in a private medical facility that didn't exist on any municipal records, Jean found Amara sitting in a hallway, still covered in other people's blood. "Thank you," he said simply, taking her hands in his. "You kept her alive. You kept me from losing her again." Amara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man beneath the monster. A man who'd lost everything he'd cared about once before. A man terrified of losing it again. "I need you to make a choice," he said quietly. "You can walk away from this. I can arrange for your return to civilian life. Your family will receive the money I promised, the protection, everything we agreed upon. Or you can stay, knowing exactly what I am, what I've done, what I'll need to do to keep you and Daniel and Elena and everyone else I care about alive." Amara thought of the warehouse, of Elena's empty eyes, of the sound of gunfire, of her mother and Legos, now protected by Jin's network, of Daniel slowly learning to trust again. "I'm staying," she said, "but only because someone needs to keep you human, and I think that's going to be a full-time job." 3 months later, Amara was sitting in the mansion's library when Jean entered with a proposition that was both generous and terrifying. "Elena is recovering," he said. "Daniel is learning to trust again. This household is becoming something that resembles a family, and I want to expand your role." He sat across from her, his expression vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "Stay," he whispered. "Not as Daniel's nurse. Not as my employee. Stay because this house hasn't felt like a home until you were in it. Stay because you showed me there's more to strength than power. Stay because I need someone who reminds me every day that there are lines I shouldn't cross." Amara looked at him. This complicated, dangerous, broken man who had somehow become the center of a world she never knew existed. "I'll stay," she said, "but under one condition, that we build something different with Daniel, not a version of you, not a power player in your empire. We give him the choice to be something else, something better." For a long moment, Jean said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Agreed," he said. For him, we built something different. Outside the library windows, Chicago stretched into the distance. A city of millions, each with their own story of survival, their own choices that changed everything. Amara Okafor had made hers in an alley on a frozen January night. And now she was building something new from the pieces of all their broken lives. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was hers. And for the first time since leaving Legos, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 6 months had transformed the Blackwood mansion from a fortress into something resembling a home. Amara watched from the library window as Daniel practiced his morning glucose checks in the garden, his movements now automatic rather than resigned. Elena sat nearby, sketching architectural drawings that had become her therapy, her way of rebuilding the mind that trauma had fractured. The woman who had returned from that warehouse was different from the one in the photographs, harder perhaps, but alive in ways that mattered. Amara's role had evolved beyond medical monitoring into something she hadn't expected. She was becoming the bridge between Jin's world of calculated violence and the family's need for normalcy. Elena trusted her in ways that surprised them both. Daniel confided fears he couldn't share with his parents. Jean sought her counsel on decisions that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with humanity. The morning routine had become sacred. Daniel's first blood sugar check, Elena's coffee in the sunroom, Jin's security briefings conducted in Korean while Amara pretended not to understand the tension in his voice. Mrs. Wu moved through the mansion like a guardian spirit, maintaining order in a household that balanced on the edge of chaos every day. Daniel's 16th birthday approached with the weight of decisions that would shape his future. College applications sat on his desk, architectural programs at universities far from Chicago's underworld politics. Jean had promised his son choices, but Amara understood the complexity of keeping that promise when your name carried the kind of power that made enemies of everyone. The first sign of new trouble came during breakfast on a Tuesday morning in October. Jin's phone rang with the particular urgency that made everyone in the household freeze. He answered in Korean, his voice sharp, and Amara caught enough words to understand that federal agents had been asking questions at the harbor. Not about shipments, about personnel. About a Nigerian nurse who had appeared in Jin's life 6 months earlier and never left. When Jean hung up, he looked at Amara with an expression she hadn't seen since the night they rescued Elena. Calculation mixed with something that might have been regret. "We need to talk," he said quietly. After Daniel's appointment this afternoon, Dr. Chen's office had become a monthly ritual. Daniel's endocrinologist was one of the few medical professionals who understood the complexity of his condition without asking questions about the scarred bodyguards in the waiting room. Today's appointment was routine. Blood work, glucose monitor calibration, medication adjustments that kept Daniel's diabetes from becoming a daily crisis. But Amara noticed the federal agents in the parking structure. 2 cars, unmarked but obvious to anyone trained to watch for surveillance. They weren't hiding. They wanted to be seen. In the car afterward, Daniel was quiet in the way that meant his blood sugar was dropping. Amara checked his monitor. 67 milligrams per deciliter and falling. She handed him glucose tablets without being asked, a choreography of medical care that had become second nature. "They're watching us," Daniel said, not looking up from his phone. "They've always been watching us," Amara replied. "Today they want us to know it." "What does that mean?" "It means the game is changing." That evening, Jin's study felt smaller than usual. Elena sat beside him, her presence a reminder of what they'd already survived together. Amara took the chair across from them, understanding that this conversation would alter everything. "The FBI has opened an investigation into money laundering through several Chicago businesses," Jean began without preamble. "They're building a case, and you've become a person of interest. Not as a suspect, but as someone who might provide information about my household." Amara felt the familiar chill of being trapped between worlds she didn't fully understand. "What kind of information?" "Your immigration status, your employment history, your access to our family's private medical information. They believe you might be willing to cooperate in exchange for protection." Elena spoke for the first time. "They don't understand you at all." "No," Jean agreed. "But that doesn't make them less dangerous." Amara thought about the federal agents in the parking garage, about the life she'd built in this house, about the promises she'd made to keep this family together. "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing," Jean said. "That's the point. If you do nothing, if you continue your life exactly as you've been living it, the investigation will eventually focus elsewhere. But you need to understand what you're choosing. If you stay, you'll be choosing a side in a war that might destroy everything we've built here." Amara looked at Elena's sketches on the side table. Architectural drawings of a community center, something beautiful and permanent and hopeful. She looked at the family photographs that Jean still couldn't bear to remove. She thought about Daniel upstairs, probably checking his blood sugar again because stress made his diabetes unpredictable. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "But we need a plan." The plan involved normalcy as a weapon. Daniel would continue his college preparation, his library visits, his careful navigation of teenage life under surveillance. Elena would continue her therapy, her art, her slow reconstruction of a life interrupted by 3 years of captivity. Amara would continue her nursing education, now accelerated through a program that Jean had arranged at Northwestern. But beneath the surface, everything was changing. Daniel had begun talking to Sophia at the library. Not the careful, distant interactions he'd described before, but actual conversations about engineering, about her prosthetics research, about the possibility that they might study at the same university next year. His glucose levels spiked every Thursday before these meetings, dropped dangerously afterward, a physiological response to emotional stress that made Amara's job increasingly complex. One Thursday evening in November, Daniel came home with a glucose reading of 43 milligrams per deciliter and a smile that lit up his entire face. Amara administered emergency glucose while he told her about Sophia's presentation on affordable prosthetics for children in rural communities. She asked if I wanted to work on a project with her. Daniel said, his words slightly slurred from hypoglycemia. Something about medical device accessibility in developing countries. She thinks my architectural background could help with designing manufacturing facilities. Amara felt her heart break and soar simultaneously. This was what normal teenage life looked like. This was also what could get someone killed in Jin's world. Did you say yes? I told her I'd think about it. I wanted to ask you first. Amara looked at this boy who'd learned to navigate life-threatening medical crises with more grace than most adults, who'd been denied normal relationships because of his father's choices, who was finally being offered something that looked like hope. What does your father think? I haven't told him yet. That conversation happened 2 nights later. Jean listened to Daniel's explanation with the focused attention he gave to business negotiations. Elena sat beside their son, her hand resting on his shoulder in silent support. Working with her means spending time together outside the library, Jean said finally. It means travel, potentially. Research sites, manufacturing facilities, universities. It means expanding your world beyond the parameters I can control. Daniel's response was steady, adult in a way that made Amara proud and terrified. I understand the risks, Dad. But I also understand what happens if I live my entire life avoiding them. You and Amara and Mom, you've given me the tools to manage my health. Now you have to trust me to manage my life. Jean was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every decision he'd made since his wife's supposed death 3 years earlier. If you do this, you'll need constant medical support. Amara will have to be involved in ways that might compromise her safety. Are you prepared to accept that responsibility? Daniel looked at Amara with eyes that reminded her of the night she'd found him dying in an alley. Yes, he said simply, if she's willing. 2 weeks before Christmas, Elena had her first major PTSD episode since returning home. It started during dinner, triggered by the sound of Jin's phone ringing with a particular tone that meant emergency. One moment she was discussing Daniel's college application essays. The next she was hyperventilating, convinced that the warehouse was real and the dining room was the hallucination. Amara found her in the bathroom, sitting in the bathtub with her knees drawn to her chest, rocking slightly. The clinical part of her mind cataloged symptoms: rapid breathing, dilated pupils, dissociation. The human part of her mind recognized trauma reasserting itself at the moment when life had finally begun to feel safe. Elena, she said softly, you're at home. You're safe. Jean and Daniel are in the dining room. Mrs. Wu is in the kitchen. I'm here with you. It took 20 minutes for Elena to return to the present. 20 minutes of Amara talking her through breathing exercises, grounding techniques, the careful architecture of trauma therapy. When Elena's breathing finally normalized, she looked at Amara with eyes that held gratitude and shame in equal measure. I thought I was getting better. You were getting better. Recovery isn't linear. It's not a straight line from broken to healed. Elena's voice was small, defeated. Daniel saw me. He saw me like this. Daniel saw you fighting. He saw you surviving. There's a difference. That night, Jean found Amara in the library reading trauma therapy materials she'd ordered from the medical school bookstore. Thank you, he said, sitting across from her, for knowing what to do. I didn't know what to do. I just knew what Elena needed in that moment. Jean was quiet for a while, studying the books spread across the table. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she rarely heard from him. I built this household on control, on the belief that if I could manage every variable, anticipate every threat, I could keep everyone safe. But trauma doesn't follow rules. Love doesn't follow rules. And healing, apparently, doesn't follow rules either. Elena is healing. It takes time. I know. But watching her struggle, watching Daniel take risks I can't control, watching you navigate a world that could destroy you because you chose to stay with us. It's teaching me that some things are more important than safety. The federal investigation intensified after New Year. Agents interviewed Dr. Chun, Mrs. Wu's grocery store owner, the security guard at Northwestern who'd seen Amara on campus. They were building a profile, not for prosecution, but for recruitment. They wanted to flip her, to convince her that cooperation was the only path to safety. The approach came on a Wednesday morning in February. Amara was walking across Northwestern's campus when a woman in a gray coat fell into step beside her. Miss Okafor. Agent Sarah Collins, FBI. I was hoping we could talk. Amara kept walking. About what? About your situation. About the choices you're going to face in the next few months. About the fact that association with organized crime can complicate your immigration status in ways that might surprise you. They walked in silence for several steps before Agent Collins continued. Jean Blackwood is under investigation for money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit violence. We're not asking you to wear a wire or provide evidence. We're asking you to consider your own future. Your family in Nigeria depends on your financial support. That becomes impossible from federal prison. Amara stopped walking. You're threatening me. I'm offering you an alternative. Cooperation in exchange for immunity. A path to permanent residency that doesn't depend on a criminal organization. A chance to continue your medical career without the complications of your current associations. Agent Collins handed her a business card. Simple white cardstock with a phone number. Think about it, Miss Okafor. Think about what you really owe people who put you in this position. That night, Amara sat in her room holding two business cards. The first, cream-colored with silver lettering, had brought her into Jin's world 6 months ago. The second, simple white with black text, offered her a way out. She thought about her mother in Lagos, about her brother's medical expenses, about the life she could build if she walked away from the Blackwood family. She also thought about Elena's panic attacks, about Daniel's glucose emergencies, about Jin's rare moments of vulnerability when he admitted that maintaining this household required more than power and money. At midnight, she made a decision that would echo through everything that followed. She burned both business cards in the bathroom sink and went to bed. March brought Daniel's acceptance letter to MIT's architectural engineering program. The celebration dinner was interrupted by Jin's phone ringing with news that federal agents had raided the harbor office. No arrests, but enough evidence seized to suggest that the investigation was moving toward indictments. Daniel's glucose spiked to 204 milligrams per deciliter during the phone call. Stress-induced hyperglycemia that required immediate insulin administration. Amara worked mechanically, adjusting his pump settings while Jean paced the dining room, speaking rapid Korean to his attorney. When the crisis stabilized, when Jin's phone calls ended, the family sat in silence around a dinner that had gone cold. This is my fault, Daniel said finally. If I hadn't gotten involved with Sophia, if I'd kept my world smaller. Elena reached across the table to take her son's hand. Your involvement with Sophia has nothing to do with your father's business problems. You can't live your life taking responsibility for choices that were made before you were born. But Jin's expression suggested a different calculation. The federal investigation had intensified specifically because of Amara's presence in their household. The timing wasn't coincidental. Daniel's relationship with Sophia created additional vulnerabilities. Every expansion of their world created new pressure points that could be exploited. We need to consider our options, Jean said carefully. All of our options. Amara understood what he wasn't saying. That keeping the family together might require sacrificing individual dreams. That Daniel's future at MIT might be impossible if Jean faced federal charges. That her own presence in their household might be the catalyst that destroyed everything they'd built. The crisis came on a Thursday morning in April. Daniel was at the library working on his final project with Sophia when federal agents executed simultaneous raids on 3 Blackwood properties. The mansion, the harbor office, and a downtown building that housed Jin's legitimate business operations. Amara was in the kitchen with Mrs. Wu when the front door exploded inward. Armed agents flooded through the house with military precision, shouting commands, securing rooms, treating the household like a terrorist compound rather than a family home. Elena was in the sunroom when they found her. The sight of armed men triggered an immediate panic response that sent her into complete dissociation. She curled into a corner, hyperventilating, unable to recognize that these weren't the men who had held her captive for 3 years. Mrs. Wu, hands up, don't move, freeze, get down. The commands overlapped, shouted by men who saw only potential threats rather than an elderly housekeeper and a nursing student trying to care for a trauma survivor. Amara ignored the agents pointing weapons at her and knelt beside Elena. She spoke quietly, calmly, using the grounding techniques that had worked during previous episodes. Elena was having a panic attack, she told the agents. She needed medical attention, not interrogation. The lead agent, a man whose badge identified him as Special Agent Morrison, approached with clipboard and handcuffs. Amara Okafor, you're being detained for questioning in connection with an ongoing federal investigation into money laundering and organized crime activities. Elena's blood sugar, Amara said, still focusing on Elena's breathing. She's diabetic. If she doesn't eat something in the next 10 minutes, she'll have a medical emergency. This wasn't true. Elena wasn't diabetic. But Amara understood that federal agents wouldn't risk a medical liability, and the lie bought time for Elena's panic attack to resolve. Daniel's glucose monitor alarm went off at exactly 11:47 a.m., 43 minutes into the raid. The continuous glucose monitor that Amara had synchronized to her phone showed a reading of 39 milligrams per deciliter. Severe hypoglycemia, the kind that preceded seizures and brain damage. He's at the Northwestern Library, Amara told Agent Morrison. Building collapse, 4th floor study area. He has type 1 diabetes, and he's having a medical emergency. If someone doesn't reach him with glucose in the next 5 minutes, he'll die. Agent Morrison studied his clipboard, apparently weighing law enforcement priorities against medical liability. We'll send someone to check. That's not good enough. His condition requires specific protocols. His emergency kit is in his backpack, but if he's unconscious, he can't self-administer. Someone needs to know how to use glucagon injection, how to position him to prevent choking, how to recognize the signs of diabetic coma. You're not leaving this house. Then Daniel dies, and you explain to a federal judge why you prevented medical care during a law enforcement action. The calculation that followed played out across Agent Morrison's face in real time. A dead teenager would complicate the investigation in ways that exceeded any intelligence value Amara might provide. Public relations disasters had ended federal careers over smaller miscalculations. 2 agents will accompany you. You have 30 minutes. The ride to Northwestern happened in silence, except for the glucose monitor alarm that continued to sound from Amara's phone. 37 mg per deciliter. 34. The numbers dropped with terrifying consistency, each reading bringing Daniel closer to irreversible brain damage. She found him in the study area exactly where she'd expected, slumped over his laptop with Sophia kneeling beside him, trying to wake him up. His skin was gray, his breathing shallow, his body beginning the shutdown process that preceded diabetic coma. Amara moved with clinical precision. Glucose tablets under his tongue, glucagon injection into his thigh, positioning to maintain his airway while the glucose took effect. Sophia watched with the focused attention of someone learning procedures she might need to know in the future. The federal agents watched everything, taking notes, documenting medical protocols that might later be used as evidence of Amara's importance to the household. Daniel's consciousness returned slowly, his pupils focusing, color returning to his face. The first words he spoke were Sophia's name, then a question about his blood sugar reading. Normal priorities for someone whose life depended on glucose management. When the immediate crisis passed, Agent Morrison approached with handcuffs. Miss Okafor, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering. Sophia stood up, her voice sharp with the kind of anger that suggested she understood more about power dynamics than most engineering students. She just saved his life. What kind of people arrest someone for providing medical care? Agent Morrison ignored her, focusing on Amara. You have the right to remain silent. 6 hours later, Amara sat in a federal holding facility wondering if she'd made the right choice in burning Agent Collins's business card 2 months earlier. The interview room was designed for psychological pressure. Fluorescent lights, metal table, chairs bolted to the floor. Agent Collins sat across from her with a file folder and the expression of someone who'd predicted this outcome. You could have avoided this, Agent Collins began. I gave you an opportunity to cooperate voluntarily. Instead, You chose loyalty to a criminal organization over your own future. I chose medical ethics over federal intimidation. Agent Collins opened the file folder. Inside were photographs, documents, bank records that painted a picture of Amara's life that she barely recognized. Immigration documents showing her temporary status. Hospital records from the night she'd met Daniel. Financial transfers to Lagos that exceeded her legitimate income. Jean Blackwood has been using you to launder money through overseas medical payments, Agent Collins explained. Your mother's hospital bills, your brother's medical expenses, those payments aren't charity. They're criminal proceeds being converted into legitimate medical expenses to disguise their origin. Amara felt the floor shift beneath her understanding of everything she'd believed about her situation. The money that had saved her family, that had provided medical care her father hadn't received, was the proceeds of crimes she'd helped facilitate without knowing it. You didn't know, Agent Collins continued. That's why we're offering you immunity. You were manipulated by people who understood your vulnerabilities and exploited them for criminal purposes. You don't have to go to prison for their choices. The immunity agreement was 15 pages of legal language that offered Amara a path out of federal prosecution in exchange for testimony about Jin's household operations. Financial records, security procedures, conversations she'd overheard, medical information that might reveal the extent of violence within the organization. It also included a provision for witness protection, relocation away from Chicago, a new identity that would let her continue her medical career without the complications of her association with organized crime. You have 24 hours to decide, Agent Collins said, closing the file folder. Your attorney will explain the options, but understand this. If you refuse immunity, you'll face money laundering charges that carry a mandatory minimum of 5 years in federal prison. Your immigration status will be revoked. Your family in Nigeria will lose their medical support. Everything you've worked for disappears. That night, in a holding cell that smelled like disinfectant and desperation, Amara thought about the choice that had brought her to this moment. A dying boy in an alley. A phone call that changed everything. A family that had somehow become her own. She thought about Elena's panic attacks, about Jin's rare moments of vulnerability, about Daniel's college acceptance letter that might mean nothing if his father faced federal prosecution. She thought about her mother in Lagos, about medical bills that might have been paid with criminal proceeds, about the complexity of love and loyalty in a world where every choice carried consequences she couldn't predict. At 3 a.m., a guard brought her a message. Daniel Blackwood had been hospitalized with diabetic ketoacidosis, a life-threatening condition that occurred when blood sugar remained elevated for extended periods. The stress of the raids, combined with his inability to properly manage his glucose levels without Amara's assistance, had triggered a medical crisis that required intensive care. The message included a handwritten note from Elena. He's asking for you. The immunity hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. the next morning. Amara sat in the federal courthouse with a court-appointed attorney who explained her options with the detached professionalism of someone who processed these decisions every day. Immunity meant freedom, but it also meant betraying a family that had trusted her with their most vulnerable moments. Prison meant preserving that trust while sacrificing her own future and her family's medical care. At 8:45 a.m., Agent Collins approached with a final offer. Daniel Blackwood is in intensive care. His condition is critical, and his medical team is asking for someone familiar with his case to provide consultation. We can arrange for you to assist with his medical care while you're cooperating with our investigation. It was a perfect trap. Amara's medical expertise as leverage for her testimony, Daniel's crisis as motivation for her cooperation, the family's need for her skills balanced against their loyalty to Jean. When Judge Harrison called the hearing to order at 9 a.m., Amara stood with a clarity that surprised her. Your Honor, I decline the immunity agreement. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Agent Collins closing her file folder with slightly more force than necessary. I understand the consequences of this decision, Amara continued. I understand that I'm facing federal charges, immigration complications, and the loss of everything I've worked for. But I also understand that some things are more important than personal safety. Judge Harrison studied her with the expression of someone who'd seen few people voluntarily choose prison over immunity. Miss Okafor, you understand that this decision is irreversible. Once you refuse immunity, The government's offer is withdrawn permanently. I understand, Your Honor. Then I'll see you at sentencing in 6 weeks. Amara was released on bail pending sentencing, a legal technicality that gave her 42 days to resolve Daniel's medical crisis and help the family prepare for her imprisonment. Jean posted the bail through attorneys who understood the federal system better than she did. The reunion in the hospital intensive care unit was complicated by federal monitoring, court-ordered restrictions on her movement, and Daniel's condition that required round-the-clock medical supervision. But it was also a confirmation of the choice she'd made. Elena hugged her with the desperate gratitude of someone who'd watched her son suffer without the medical support he needed. Daniel, weak from 3 days of uncontrolled blood sugar, squeezed her hand with the strength he had left. "You came back," he whispered. "I told you I wouldn't run." Jean stood beside the hospital bed with an expression that contained gratitude, regret, and something that might have been love for a woman who'd chosen loyalty over survival. The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later was a formality. Federal guidelines for money laundering carried mandatory minimums that Judge Harrison couldn't reduce despite character testimony from Dr. Rodriguez, letters of support from Northwestern faculty, and Daniel's medical team. 3 years in federal prison, followed by deportation to Nigeria. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, Amara looked back at the courtroom where Jean, Elena, and Daniel sat in the front row. Daniel was crying, his glucose monitor beeping with readings that reflected the stress of watching someone he loved being taken away. Elena mouthed words that Amara understood despite the distance. "Thank you." Jean nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of promises about her family's protection, about maintaining the medical support that would keep her mother alive, about ensuring that her choice to preserve their family wouldn't destroy her own. Federal prison was a graduate education in survival that nursing school hadn't provided. Amara learned to navigate hierarchies of power that had nothing to do with credentials and everything to do with respect earned through consistency, competence, and the ability to provide medical care to women who'd been abandoned by every system designed to help them. She worked in the prison medical facility, treating conditions that ranged from diabetes complications to overdoses to injuries that were never officially reported. The irony wasn't lost on her that federal prison provided better medical experience than some hospitals, exposing her to trauma surgery, emergency protocols, and psychological conditions that had prepared her for whatever came next. Letters arrived monthly. Daniel's glucose logs, always perfect because Elena had learned to provide the medical support he needed. Elena's architectural drawings, community centers, and medical facilities that suggested hope for a future beyond trauma. Jin's updates on family protection that kept her mother's medical care funded, her brother's treatment uninterrupted. The letter that arrived 18 months into her sentence was different. Daniel's acceptance to MIT's graduate program in biomedical engineering, with a focus on diabetes management technology. His glucose control had stabilized to the point where he could travel, attend university, build relationships without constant medical supervision. His research proposal was developing continuous glucose monitoring systems for low-income communities in developing countries. Technology that could prevent the kind of crisis that had brought them together in a Chicago alley 2 years earlier. Elena's recovery had progressed to the point where she was teaching art therapy at a community center, helping other trauma survivors rebuild their lives through creative expression. Her panic attacks had become infrequent, manageable, part of a healing process that moved forward instead of backward. Jin's legal situation had been resolved through plea agreements that resulted in financial penalties rather than prison time. The federal investigation had moved on to other targets, other criminal organizations that posed greater threats than a man whose primary crime was loving his family enough to protect them through violence. The release hearing was scheduled for 3 months before her original sentence ended, a reduction based on exemplary behavior and her contributions to the prison medical program. Amara stood before a different judge in a different courtroom, but with the same choice that had defined every critical moment of her life. Freedom meant deportation to Nigeria. It meant leaving the family she'd helped rebuild, losing the medical career she'd worked toward, accepting permanent separation from the people who'd become her world. Or she could choose something else. Judge Martinez studied the immigration appeal that Jin's attorneys had filed on her behalf. A petition for permanent residency based on extraordinary circumstances, humanitarian considerations, and medical expertise that served the public interest. Ms. Okafor, Judge Martinez said, "This is highly unusual. Immigration appeals are rarely granted under these circumstances. However, your case presents factors that warrant special consideration." The factors included letters from Daniel's medical team, testimony about Elena's ongoing treatment needs, documentation of Amara's role in preventing what could have been a fatal diabetic crisis during a federal law enforcement action. They also included a provision that Amara hadn't expected: legal adoption papers filed by Jean and Elena Blackwood, making her a permanent member of the family she'd chosen over her own freedom. "Your Honor," Amara said, standing with the same clarity she'd felt during her immunity hearing 2 years earlier, "I accept the family that chose me when I chose them." Judge Martinez signed the order granting permanent residency at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. Amara walked out of the federal courthouse into Chicago snow that felt like absolution. Daniel was waiting beside a black SUV that looked nothing like the invasion vehicle from that first night in the alley. He was taller now, healthier, his glucose monitor reading a perfect 94 milligrams per deciliter that reflected years of medical management and emotional stability. Elena stood beside him with architectural drawings tucked under her arm. Plans for a medical clinic that would provide diabetes care for low-income communities, a project funded by legitimate businesses that had replaced Jin's criminal operations. Jean waited beside the car door with an expression that contained everything they'd survived together: gratitude, love, respect for a woman who'd rebuilt their family by refusing to abandon them when abandonment would have been rational. The drive home through Chicago streets felt different than it had 3 years earlier. The city looked the same, but Amara understood now that home wasn't a place. It was the people who stayed when staying was dangerous, who chose loyalty over safety, who built something beautiful from the pieces of broken lives. The Blackwood mansion had changed during her incarceration. Elena's art filled the walls where family photographs had once stood in isolation. Daniel's college acceptance letters were framed beside his glucose logs that showed months of perfect diabetic management. Jin's study contained books on legitimate business development, legal documents for the medical clinic, evidence of a life redirected toward building rather than destroying. Mrs. Wu had prepared dinner with the precision of someone celebrating a resurrection. The table was set for 4, the family configuration that had taken years of survival to achieve. During dinner, Daniel talked about his research into affordable glucose monitoring technology. Elena described her plans for the community center that would provide art therapy for trauma survivors. Jean outlined the business plan for the medical clinic that would serve Chicago's underserved communities. Amara listened with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd helped build something permanent from chaos, love from violence, hope from desperation. After dinner, she sat in the library where she'd first agreed to Jin's proposition 3 years earlier. The same chair, the same window overlooking gardens that had once represented only wealth and power. Now they represented something more complex. Stability, family, the possibility that people could change, that love could transform even the most damaged lives. Jean found her there an hour later, carrying 2 cups of tea and an expression that suggested he had something important to say. "Thank you," he said simply, sitting across from her in the same chair where he'd offered her a business proposition that changed everything. "For what? For choosing us. For staying when you could have run. For coming back when anyone else would have stayed away. For showing me that family isn't something you're born into, it's something you build." Amara looked at this man who'd evolved from a dangerous stranger into something approaching a father, a brother, a partner in the complex work of maintaining a household that balanced on the edge of love and survival every day. "Thank you for giving me the choice." Outside the library windows, Chicago stretched into the distance. A city of millions, each with their own story of survival, their own choices that changed everything. Amara Okafor had made hers in an alley on a frozen January night 3 years earlier. She'd chosen love over safety, family over freedom, hope over certainty. Now she was building something new from the pieces of all their broken lives. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she left Nigeria, but it was hers. It was theirs. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged.